Hi, everyone. Welcome to our last talk of this morning's session. I'm very pleased to be introducing to you Professor Alison Gopnik from the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Gopnik is a professor of psychology and affiliate professor of philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley, where she has taught since 1988. She is well known as an authority on the philosophy of mind and a preeminent developmental psychologist. Dr. Gopnik received her BA in psychology and philosophy from McGill University, so to some extent this is a homecoming, and a PhD in experimental psychology from Oxford University. She's a world leader in cognitive science, particularly in the study of children's learning and development, and is famous for her work showing that children think and learn much the way scientists do. She's the author of over 100 journal articles and several books, including the best-selling and critically acclaimed popular books, The Scientist in the Crib, The Philosophical Baby, What Children's Minds Tell Us About Love, Truth, and the Meaning of Life, and The Gardener and the Carpenter, What the New Science of Child Development Tells Us About the Relationship Between Parents and Children. In 2013, she was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she is also a fellow of the Cognitive Science Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. This past year, she was awarded the very prestigious APS James McKean Cattell Fellow Award in honor of a lifetime of outstanding contribution to applied psychological research. So we're very lucky to have her here today. Please, everyone, join me in wishing Professor Gopnik a warm welcome to Maine. Professor Gopnik, take it away.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And I have had a marvelous sabbatical at Mila and grew up in Montreal, so that's kind of old home week for me. What I'm going to do in this talk is, for the first half of the talk, I'm going to talk about some ideas about childhood and the role that childhood plays in intelligence, and particularly the kind of role that childhood intelligence could play in designing more effective AI systems. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm going to talk about what that suggests about consciousness and phenomenology. And essentially, the argument that I'm going to make is that there are very different kinds of representations and intelligence in childhood and in adulthood, and that they come with different kinds of phenomenology, different kinds of consciousness. And a lot of the theories of consciousness have really focused on the more adult kinds of representations and intelligence, and it would be useful and important to focus on the childhood ones as well. So first of all, let me start out by pointing out that, the great Alan Turing himself, in the very first paper that described the Turing test, suggested, after he talks about the Turing test, said, well, wait a minute, maybe this is all wrong. Maybe instead of trying to have a program that simulates the adult mind, instead we should try and produce one that simulates the child's. And this is way back in 1950. And that idea of Turing's has been more and more something that's been revived. And I think the kind of obvious reason for reviving it is that the new renaissance of AI has depended a lot on machine learning, on the idea that you could have artificial systems that learn from the experiences that they have. And children are the best learners that we know of in the universe. So if we want systems that learn, children would be a good place. Looking at children would be a good place to look. And increasingly, for example, in the DARPA Machine Common Sense program that I'm part of, people in AI are looking to childhood, and people in cognitive development are collaborating with people in AI. But I want to make in some ways, an even stronger claim, which is not just that children could be a model because they're humans who learn, but that there are specific things about children in particular, as opposed to adults, that make them especially powerful learning machines. And I'm going to suggest that there's actually a trade-off between the kinds of things that children do that make them such good learners and the kinds of things that adults do that make them so good at actually functioning in the world. So let me start out by talking about a question that I think is often under-asked in psychology and cognitive science, although it's a question that comes up a lot in evolutionary biology. And that question is, why do we have children at all? I mean, not the obvious answer, but why is it that creatures have this long period of immaturity? Because it would seem to be sort of evolutionarily deleterious to have organisms and animals that are really not capable of taking care of themselves and that need a lot of care and resources from the adults. And it's particularly puzzling because when you look across many different kinds of species of animals, sort of amazing range from primates and mammals to birds, even to insects, you see this very striking relationship between how long a period of immaturity, how long a period of childhood there is, and to put it anthropomorphically, how smart the adults are. In particular, how much the creature depends on flexible learning about the environment as opposed to relying on, say, innate reflexes or innate structures that allow them to deal with a specific environment. And sort of the poster animals for this are not even mammals, but birds. So if you compare, for example, the New Caledonian crow, crows and corvids in general are extremely smart birds. This is a bird who's figured out how to use a wire to get food in the lab. And those birds are fledglings for as long as 2 years, which is a very long time in the life of the bird, particularly these New Caledonian crows. If you compare that to our friend, the domestic chicken, chickens are, with apologies to chicken lovers, chickens are very, very good at doing one or two things very well, like pecking for grain. And they have computations in place, we can show literally from the time they're born, that allow them to do that. But they're not very flexible. They're not smart. They're not good at figuring out how to survive or do something new in a new environment like the lab. And you see this relationship very generally. And of course, humans are the most dramatic example of this. So human children are immature and dependent for twice as long as our closest primate relatives. By the time chimps are 7 years old, they're consuming as much, they're producing as much food as they're consuming. And even in forager cultures, humans aren't doing that till they're 15 or so. So we have this very, very extended childhood, a large amount of parental investment and resources. And of course, we also have exceptionally large brains, and we rely more than any other creature on learning about our environments. So that suggests that there's something about this developmental strategy, what evolutionary biologists call life history, this way of having a long childhood, not very many babies, and a lot of parental investment, that might be connected to our kinds of intelligence. And what I've argued is that you could think about, so why would you see this developmental pattern? Why would you see this relationship? And what I've suggested is that it's related to an idea that's very old and very deep in computer science and in neuroscience, which is the idea of an exploitation versus exploration trade-off. And the idea is that if you're trying to solve a problem in a high-dimensional space where there's lots of different alternatives available to you, there's a fundamental foundational trade-off between how broadly you search, how many new ideas you have, and how quickly you settle on a good answer. So classic distinction is between a kind of low temperature search of a space and a high temperature search. You've got a big box, as it were, full of potential solutions. One thing you could do is just look very close to where you already are, try and find something that works pretty well, pretty quickly. Another thing that you could do is that you could bounce around the space, look very broadly, try one thing, then try something else that's very different. And those two strategies have an intrinsic trade-off. There isn't a simple way of just maximizing that trade-off. If you have the low temperature search, you're more likely to settle on a good answer, a high probability answer, but you might miss an actually better answer that's further away in the space. You might in particular get caught in a local optimum. Whereas if you choose the high temperature search, you're going to be slower to settle on a high probability answer, but you're more likely to find the low probability answer. So you might waste a lot of time trying things that are not actually very likely to be successful, but you're more likely to find an unlikely option. And that low temperature versus high temperature contrast is just a particular example of this general tension between exploiting, finding solutions that will work, using them quickly, using them efficiently, doing things to get on in the world, which of course in some sense from the evolutionary perspective is ultimately what you want, versus exploring, checking out different possibilities, generating different kinds of solutions. And in computer science and optimality theory, one of the ways that people talk about trying to solve this problem is by first having a period of exploration and then having a period of exploitation, and sometimes having sort of cycles of exploration and exploitation. And a specific version of this is the idea of simulated annealing. The idea is start out with this broad, exploratory, high temperature search, look at the big contours of the problem, and then settle into a narrower, more refined search once you have a sense of how the problem works. And variants of this, explore first, exploit later, high temperature first, low temperature later strategy get used a lot. Although interestingly, there doesn't seem to be a really general theory about exactly how you should implement these ideas. So the general hypothesis that I've been arguing for the last couple of years is that you could think about childhood as evolution's way of resolving these explore-exploit trade-offs and performing something like simulated annealing. And I have a review article that makes a lot of arguments with a lot of evidence for this in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society recently. So the idea is that across species, and certainly in humans, you start out with this period of wide-ranging exploration and learning, and then you use that to exploit later on. And I think from that perspective, it gives you a kind of different picture of what childhood is about. So very often people think of children or think of childhood as essentially sort of defective adulthood. So it's as if, the point of being a child is just to get to the point of being an adult. And many things that are, and the picture that I'm presenting is to think about children as having a really fundamentally different kind of intelligence, not just adult intelligence minus something, but a fundamentally different kind of intelligence. And from that perspective, many things that are features from the perspective of exploration are bugs from the perspective of exploitation, and vice versa. So many things that have traditionally been seen as evidence that children are irrational or limited or problematic in various ways actually makes sense if you think about them as being these wide-ranging explorers. So producing a lot of noisy, variable, random behavior is something that's quite sensible if you're exploring, not so sensible if you're trying to actually act effectively in the world. And I think one of the big interesting questions at the moment is how much is children's exploration or AI exploration, how noisy should it be versus how focused should it be? Taking risks is a sensible thing to do if you're trying to explore the space, not so sensible if you're trying to exploit. And anyone who, as I have, has spent my sabbatical with my wonderful 15-month-old grandson has seen the amount of work that you need to just keep a toddler from killing themselves because of their risk-taking propensity. Impulsivity is another example. Adults' exploitation really demands this kind of long-term planning, inhibition, control. But those are not good things if what you want is to explore the space as widely as possible. And play you could think of as being the sort of behavioral index of exploration, both external exploratory kind of play and internal imaginative play. By definition, play is the opposite of work. It's the opposite of exploitation. And again, across many, many different species, you see that play is characteristic of young animals, and that's certainly true of humans. Curiosity is the kind of affective equivalent of exploration. It's the sign, it's a kind of motivational system, an affective system designed to bring about exploration. And I think there's also some interesting differences in attention. So when we think about attention, and again, when people use attention as a technique in AI, we think of it as a narrowing, right? We think of it as being something that is going to just pick out one or two relevant features of the environment. And again, that's true about adult attention. But when you look at children, and I don't have enough time to talk about all the empirical evidence for this, what you see is a much broader scope of attention. So children are taking in information about much more of the field around them. One way I put this is to say, it's not that children have trouble paying attention, it's that they have trouble not paying attention. So they get easily distracted by anything that's going on around them. So all these things that you might think of as being limitations of children, if you were trying to think about a system that could exploit, are actually advantages of children if you're thinking about them as explorers. And you see the same thing if you're actually looking at brain development. So this is a famous classic slide looking at synaptic development over time. And what you can see very characteristically in brains is this architecture where there's an early period when many new connections are being formed in response to the environment. There's a lot of plasticity. And then the connections that are used are strengthened, myelinated, et cetera. And then the connections that aren't used get pruned. And I think it's interesting that you see this architecture so often, but it's not really a common architecture in machine learning, where there tends to be a sort of single continuous function of learning. So you see fewer synaptic connections as you develop, fewer local connections, more long distance connections. You see particularly the frontal areas, prefrontal cortex becomes more active, and there's more control, including networks that I'll talk about in a minute, networks like the task and default network that seem to be designed to allow people to complete particular kinds of tasks, to focus, to do long-term planning, and also the sort of default network that allows people to ruminate, to think about themselves, and so forth. And overall, what you see with brain development is this trade-off between plasticity and efficiency, another version of the explore-exploit trade-off, where you get less plasticity with development, but more efficiency. And you see the same thing with cognitive development. So if you take an adult cognitive psychology course versus a child's cognitive development course, one of the things that's going to be really striking is that the very content of courses is going to be very different. So the cognitive psychology grown-up course is going to be about things like attention and memory. And the cognitive development course is going to be about things like theory formation and revision and pretense. So what you see with cognitive development is that as you get older, and again, there's nice experiments showing this, that you have less access to the things you aren't attending to, but more access to the things that you are attending to. So for example, you can show that younger children are actually more likely to remember something that wasn't part of their original attention than older children or adults are. You get less play, less pretense and imagination, less theory formation and revision. It becomes harder to learn language. On the other hand, you get more executive function and other kind of prefrontal task functions, more of a sense of self, more episodic memory, rumination, and other kinds of default mode functions as well. So all this suggests this shift from this early kind of explore mode to this later exploit mode. All right, well, can we actually show empirically that children are more exploratory? Well, you know, for most tasks, exactly because adults are better at exploiting, they have these greater capacities for executive function, for attention, and so forth, adults are going to do better than children. But it turns out that there's this whole range of tasks and experiments that require this kind of broad-reaching exploration, where you can show that children are actually doing better than adults. So famously, children are better at learning foreign, even babies, even infants, are better at detecting distinctions in a foreign language than in their own language, and they lose that capacity as they get older. It's kind of classic example. But children are better at learning novel artifact uses. They're better at insight, certain kinds of insight tasks. They're better, as I mentioned, at learning unattended stimuli than adults are. They prefer to actually go towards informative cues, even this kind of risk-taking example, even when they lead to negative outcomes. In our work, we've shown across a wide range of different cases that children are actually better at learning unlikely causal hypotheses than adults are. And in a bunch of very recent tasks, recent studies, there's been a kind of convergence of people showing that children are engaging in greater exploration in reinforcement learning tasks. What I'm going to do is just quickly show you one task from our lab to try and demonstrate this. This is with Emily Lequin, just a paper that just came out in Cognition. And what we did was, this is a sort of combination of a hypothesis, causal hypothesis formation task and a RL task. What happens is that you see this computer, and your task is to figure out which things, this little machine, and you get a range of different objects that you can put on the machine. And if you're told that if the object is a ZAF, you don't know what a ZAF is, and you put it on the machine, you're going to get a sticker. But if it's not a ZAF, then you're going to lose 2 stickers. And your choice is to put the objects on the machine and then figure out whether they're ZAFs or not. So I just gave you the example. You see the striped one works, the spotted one doesn't. Now you can decide, are you going to approach or avoid the black striped one? If you've got the hypothesis that spots are the things that, stripes are the things that make it that make it a ZAF, then you should approach it, and indeed you do, and you get stickers. But now here's the crucial case. How about now when you see the black spotted block? Well, if you've got this one-dimensional hypothesis about stripes versus spots, you should avoid that. You should avoid that block. But of course, the problem is that if you avoid that block, if you don't ever put it on, you're never going to discover that the actual rule is more complicated. The actual rule is that it's only the white spotted blocks that are not ZAFs. Everything else is. So the black spotted block would actually give you a reward. So this is a less initially likely hypothesis, this two-dimensional hypothesis. But if you get to that hypothesis, and if you're willing to risk losing stickers, you can actually figure out the hypothesis. And in the long run, that will be an advantage. I hope everybody understands this. And this is based on some work by Rich and Garakis, who found that when you put adults in this kind of task, they get stuck in what's called a learning trap. So what happens is they very rapidly conclude the simpler, more obvious hypothesis. They never try the things that would disconfirm that hypothesis. And so they never actually learn the true structure of the task. So what we did was we just did this task with people of different ages. And sure enough, just like Rich and Garakis, we found that the adults ended up with this one-dimensional hypothesis, which meant that they didn't try objects that they could have tried. And 6- and 7-year-olds, and even more 4- and 5-year-olds, approach the positive blocks much more often. Again, if you know any 4-year-olds, you can kind of picture this. And even though we could show that they knew perfectly well that they were losing stickers and they didn't want to lose the stickers, they still preferred finding out what would happen with the block than even if it meant that they were going to lose the stickers. And then we actually asked the participants about what the rule was. And sure enough, as you might expect, the 4- and 5-year-olds were considerably better at learning the rule, learning this more complicated two-dimensional rule, than the adults were. So this is a case where the children's exploration, even though it ended up meaning that they had less reward, enabled them to figure out the structure, particularly when the actual causal hypothesis was this somewhat unlikely one. So that's just one example of many, empirically showing that children are being more exploratory, and this is giving them an advantage in learning, although it gives them a disadvantage in terms of their immediate reward. And what we've been doing more recently is trying, we and others have been doing more recently, is trying to integrate this kind of early childhood exploration into computer science. And lots of people, I think, recently have recognized that this kind of curiosity-driven exploration, explicitly often something that people see based on what children are doing, could be a really important advantage to help machine learning. So this is work by my colleagues at Berkeley. And what our research program has been over the last year or two is to try and design environments in which we could place both children and various kinds of artificial agents, and then compare the kind of curiosity-driven exploration that we see in the children to that of agents, and try and see if we could design agents that can do some of the same things that the children are doing. So one project involves the DeepMind lab. So we're actually seeing if how kids explore an online maze and how that compares to how AIs will do it. Another project that we're doing takes off from really lovely work by Corey Lynch and Pierre Sermonet, who found that in a robotic imitation task, the robots were actually better at learning by watching play than they were by watching intentional actions. So what we've done now is we've set up this virtual playroom, and we actually have real children who are playing with the objects on the table. And then the question is, if we use that data to try and inform a robot, will they end up with more robust and flexible representations and learning? And then the last example, something that I've actually been doing since I've been at Mila, and Rosemary Key has been very involved in this, is trying to do this for causal learning. So in work that we've done over the past 20 years, we've shown that even very young children are very good at, amazingly good at learning causal structure, often better than adults are. And what we've been doing is simply giving them these Blicket detectors, our little boxes that light up when you put things on them. That's kind of our basic equipment for trying to see if children can do causal inference. And then just, again, this is an online environment, just let them explore the online environment, see what kinds of exploration they do, and how that compares with various kinds of artificial agents. And the hypothesis, which I think a lot of people have, is that having agents that, like children, got this period of exploration and used some of the same exploration techniques as children would enable one to have agents that, as adults, as it were, or as exploiters, were more robust, were more robust and better at broad generalization the way that human beings are. Okay, so that's the first part of the talk. Now I'm going to switch to talking about consciousness, which is a big, difficult subject. I don't think we're going to find a simple answer to what it is that it leads to consciousness. But I do think it's very interesting to look at the relationships between different kinds of phenomenology and different kinds of representations and intelligence and functions. And I think that's been the sort of general strategy in the psychology of understanding consciousness. So that raises the question about what's the phenomenology, what's the consciousness that's associated with these different kinds of modes of intelligence. And I think if you look at almost all the work that's been done on consciousness, trying to relate consciousness to particular kinds of representations, particular kinds of computational functions, it's focused on what I call professorial consciousness. So professorial consciousness is that you're sitting at your desk and you're desperately trying to focus on the particular task that you have at hand, and except you keep getting distracted by ruminating about how terrible things are in the world, or trying to figure out what you're going to do next, or remembering what happened yesterday. So you're kind of going back and forth as you sit at your desk and between focusing on particular tasks and ruminating and mind wandering. I love this picture. There's a nice story behind it. This is actually a picture that we saw for the first time at the Barnes Institute in Philadelphia. I was there with my husband. The Barnes has all these wonderful impressionist pictures that no one's seen anywhere else. And he came very excitedly into the room and said, "Alison, there's a beautiful Bernard in the next room that looks just like you." And I, of course, imagining some lovely impressionist lady came in and found that this was actually the picture that he had in mind. And it is a beautiful picture. And I'm rather pleased that he has it up on his desk. He has a version of it up next to his desk. Obviously, that's his vision of what I'm like most of the time, which is probably pretty accurate. But this kind of consciousness, and people like Stan Dehaene and others have elaborated a whole set of ideas about the global workspace, and about the kind of consciousness that goes with these kinds of capacities. So things like executive function, things like focused attention, on the one hand, the kinds of things that are associated with the task network seem to be associated with this kind of consciousness. And on the other hand, things like that are associated with the default network, a sense of self, a sense of ego, also seem to be associated with this kind of consciousness. So we have a very nice neuroscientific account, and even computational account, of this kind of focused exploit adult consciousness. And we have a good idea of the kinds of representational functions that it serves. But what I want to argue is that this is only just a narrow slice of consciousness in the broader sense: sentience, awareness, phenomenology. And in particular, it contrasts with a very different kind of consciousness. You can see that's sort of the same woman in the previous, as in the previous image, but in a really different state, which I'm just going to call numinous consciousness. That's a term that comes from actually from sort of the theological world. And the idea is, in some ways, numinous consciousness is exactly the opposite of professorial consciousness. So instead of being focused on a particular task or being internally driven, being focused on the self, what seems to happen in these kinds of states of consciousness is that you start eroding the boundaries between the self and the world, or the self and other people. This is my husband and me in the redwoods. And instead of being internally driven, you become outwardly driven. Instead of being focused on small parts of what is going on around you, you become open and attentive to much more of what's going on around you. So it's a distinctive kind of consciousness and phenomenology that's not only different, but in some ways almost the opposite phenomenologically of the consciousness that's been the focus of so much, so much lovely attention in the psychological and philosophical literature. And you can point to particular kinds of contexts, just as you can point to contexts in which the sort of professorial exploit consciousness takes place. You can point to particular kinds of contexts in which this kind of numinous phenomenology seems to take place. So it's the very word numinous comes from people thinking about things like various kinds of mystical experiences, but doesn't have to be mystical or connected to spirituality. Various kinds of meditative practices, particularly what's called open awareness meditation, are practices that are designed to induce exactly this kind of phenomenology. And I think it's quite interesting if you think about what it is that people do in something like open awareness meditation. Essentially what they're doing is frustrating their task and default mode network. So it means meditation involves sitting down in one place, not moving, intentionally, as it were, not trying to do something, intentionally paying attention to everything going on around you rather than just paying attention to your particular tasks or the particular internal ego that's going on. And that, in a sense, that kind of frustration of the executive function system, that denial of the global workspace, is the thing that leads to this phenomenology of a much wider range of attention. And another example of something that seems to lead to this kind of numinous wide consciousness is just the experience of awe. Is another example. Something that isn't necessarily the result of hard work the way that mystical experience or open awareness is, but there's lots of evidence that even just something like being in that beautiful redwood glade has the effect of shrinking people's sense of ego, getting rid of some of the boundaries between themselves and the world around them. So that, gesture of looking up at something that's much higher and much bigger than you, kind of the opposite of the gesture of sitting at your desk and looking down, is the kind of characteristic emotion that's associated with awe. All right, so what might some of the functional characteristics of this kind of consciousness be? Maybe it's just a kind of a spandrel, an epiphenomenon. What I've argued back in my book, The Philosophical Baby, is that this is the kind of consciousness that at least a lot of the time babies and young children have. A lot of the time babies and young children, just like adults, are fussy and unhappy and all the rest of it. But at least for a lot of the time, baby and child consciousness, I suggest, is like this. And the argument is that the kinds of both neural and functional characteristics of this kind of broader consciousness are characteristic of what you see in childhood. And this is not an original idea. If you read some of the great romantic poets and philosophers like Wordsworth and Coleridge, if you read people in the Buddhist tradition talk about beginner's mind as being the mind that you're trying to get to, the idea that children have a kind of consciousness that's like this is an idea that has been around in the sort of broader literary and philosophical tradition for a long time. But in the psychological tradition and in the kind of cognitive science tradition, often the argument, again, connected to this kind of children being defective picture, is that, babies and children must have less consciousness than adults, if they have consciousness at all, because they don't have things like a sense of ego or a sense of self, their executive function, long-term planning. Now, when I wrote The Philosophical Baby, in particular, I used some examples from things like open awareness meditation, and I talked a lot about what we know about the attentional system and the fact that we start out with this broad attentional system with broad focus and then narrow in to try and make this claim. But actually, interestingly, in the 10 years or so since, we've had a bunch of really fascinating research that gives us a better sort of experimental tool to look at this kind of consciousness. And I think it's it's confirmed a lot of the ideas that were in the philosophical baby. I mean, I would, wouldn't I? But I think it's been a really interesting development. And that work has come out of a whole very exciting set of research on what are broadly called psychedelics, so things like psilocybin. And in that research, an idea that lots of people have had is that you could think of the effects of those psychedelics, and the research is from a scientific point of view is really interesting because you can show that particular kinds of neural changes are associated with particular kinds of phenomenology. And an idea that a lot of people have had is that you could think about the effects of psychedelic chemicals as being a kind of restoration, if you will, of the childhood brain. So that the effect of psychedelics is that they seem to move the brain back into a state that's more like its state in childhood. So, for example, there's lots of evidence that psychedelics promote both structural and functional neural plasticity. So there's examples in vitro. There's really beautiful recent work by Golda Len showing that MDMA seems to open up critical periods that are otherwise closed in mice, for example. And in terms of humans, when you look at the imaging studies, there's evidence that psilocybin deactivates the default network and frontal control, exactly the things that seem to be so crucial for adult exploit kinds of consciousness. All those things seem to be deactivated by things like psilocybin. And psilocybin seems to increase local connections and decrease long-distance network segregation. And again, this is kind of all just exactly the opposite of the things that you see happening in development. So in development, what you see is pruning of the local connections and increases in long-distance connections, and then psilocybin seems to reverse that pattern. And if you think about the cognitive effects, you see very similar kinds of things to again, you see this kind of reversal of what you see in development. So you see less ego, less higher order reflection, less executive function. Those kind of adult capacities for learning, for narrow planning, et cetera, seem to fade. But on the other hand, you see more imagination, more vivid imaginative phenomenology, a sort of generally broader attention, more of this sort of sense of fewer boundaries between the self and the world and others. And you see less top-down control in general. And there's lots of arguments, I think, that some of the specific perceptual phenomenology, and Anil has talked about this and others, comes from this lessening of top-down control, the reducing valve, as Huxley described it. And of course, what this gives us is what this suggests is that the kinds, this isn't just a particular strange thing that happens with particular chemicals, but things like the kind of consciousness that has been part of human existence for forever, the kinds of things that you see in mystical states or in awe or in retreats or in meditation, in various kinds of religious practices, just seem to be doing the same kinds of things that these neural changes are leading to. And then if you think about the function of these changes, again, is this just a spandrel? Again, I think an argument for some of the therapeutic effects, which people are beginning to see with in some of these cases, is that they functionally parallel what we see in childhood. So the idea is that they're resetting a kind of period of plasticity and exploration and reopening critical periods. And the idea is that as a result of being able to have this plasticity and exploration, you can sort of, in therapeutic context, you can sort of escape from local minima that have come from a narrower focus, a narrower set of possibilities and options. And it's very important in the context of the therapy to have therapists who can actually sort of give you a kind of guide to how to do that kind of exploration. So what I want to suggest is that this kind of broader consciousness, which is very different from the kinds of consciousness that we typically, is very different from the kinds of consciousness that we we've typically explored and associated with exploitation is more like the kind of consciousness that you could see with children, and also that the function, the intelligence that's going on here is more like the kind of exploration and curiosity and so forth that you see with children. And here's a picture to try to capture some of this. So the idea is that, if you think about adult attention in particular, or adult consciousness, an idea that's been around for a long time is this idea of thinking about adult consciousness as being kind of like a spotlight. So adult consciousness is the thing that lets you narrow in on a particular idea, and a lot of the uses of attention in AI have been like that. Too. And again, people like Ashua Bengio have talked about this kind of system to more constrained kind of consciousness that comes with attention. And that's absolutely right. And it's functional and it's important. And it's something that we obviously both experience and need in adulthood. But what I want to suggest is that doesn't constitute consciousness or awareness itself. You could have this very different kind of consciousness or awareness, one that's much more, I think, like the consciousness that that babies and young children have, and like the kind of consciousness that you have in these other kinds of states, like a kind of numinous states. And that's much more like a kind of lantern. It's, rather than thinking of it as a spotlight, you could think of it as a situation in which you're getting much more information from the environment around you. You're pulling in more different kinds of information. You're exploring a wider range of options in a bouncier, noisier, more high temperature kind of way. Okay, so that's the general argument that I would make, and I think it would be helpful both in consciousness studies and in AI to try to look at a wider range of different kinds of relationships between phenomenology and function to really understand how it is that consciousness works. As I say, I don't think it's likely that we're going to end up with a single killer app solution to the problem of consciousness, where we can say, yeah, it's this thing in the brain that is responsible for consciousness. I think what will end up happening is that there'll be a complicated set of discoveries about relationships between particular kinds of phenomenology and particular kinds of function. It's very much the way that this has happened in, say, visual perception. And at the end of the day, that will turn out to be the explanation for how consciousness works, in much the same way Patty Churchland has argued for this, in much the same way that it turned out that there wasn't a single explanation for life. There are many, many different complicated relationships between the structure of non-living things and living functions. Okay, so the last thing is, how does this relate to the question of whether artificial systems are ever going to be conscious? That kind of big question that everyone would like to ask. And what I would argue is, I don't think we're in the ballpark of having an answer to that, partly because we don't yet have artificial intelligences that are in the ballpark of the kind of intelligences that we see in adults, we see in humans. But obviously, a kind of conclusion that I would make from what I've been talking about is that if you did want to if at some point we do develop something like a general intelligence, it will, I would propose, have to have something like the developmental trajectories that we see in organisms, and in particular in humans. And I highly recommend this marvelous novella by the science fiction writer Ted Chiang, where he actually tries to sort of articulate what that would be like. He imagines a world in which there are baby AIs, baby software objects that are raised and developed with adults. And I suspect that you'd have to have something like that going on if you were actually going to have AIs that had the capacities of humans. Now, whether you want to have AIs that have the capacity of humans or not, of course, is another question. But I think that developmental trajectory would have to be what you'd need for this kind of broader kinds of intelligence. And again, that raises the question about whether these kinds of artificial agents could have conscious experience or could have phenomenology. And again, I think that's very much up for grabs. My suspicion is from the evolutionary literature that you only see it if you had systems that were actually out there interacting with the world. There's some rather elegant arguments that the Cambrian explosion, for example, when we started to have animals that had sensors and that could act in the world, that was sort of the beginnings of sentience, and I suspect that that's true. But it may also be that you need biological systems, that you won't see phenomenology. But at least the sort of Ted Chiang science fiction speculation that I would make is that if you did have developing artificial agents, and they were in this early exploratory kind of state, that the phenomenology they would have would be a lot like the phenomenology that you see, I think, in babies and young children. They'd have this kind of wide-ranging beginner's mind, lantern consciousness, instead of the narrower exploit consciousness that we see in adults. Now that, of course, is all completely speculative. So let me end there, and we have some time, I think, to take questions.
Indeed, we do. Thanks very much, Alison, for a fascinating talk as usual. So our most upvoted question is from Joshua.
Okay.
So I'll just follow the votes for now.
Okay. Should I stop sharing?
You can. I think it's fine for now.
Okay. Okay. Great.
So Joshua asks, temperature annealing is a good analogy, but it is not sufficient to efficiently explore in a very high-dimensional space, where the interesting things may be a needle in a haystack or something like quantum theory. Don't you think that causal models are precisely the kind of thing that can guide such exploration more efficiently?
Okay, now I didn't know that I had a stooge in the audience in the form of Joshua, but yeah, that is exactly.
I could have told you that.
That's exactly right, and I think I think annealing is a nice general metaphor that gets at these differences between children and adults. But I think that if you actually, and as I say, there's starting to be very elegant research looking at how does this exploration actually work in children. And as I mentioned, what I think is so fascinating is that there's this kind of combination of some noisy, random, high temperature kinds of things, but then it's not noisy and random. It's not that the kids are just producing any gesture. The things that they're producing seem to be exactly the things that are giving them the most information, and in particular, giving them the most causal information. And causal structure is particularly fascinating because in the case of causal structure, we know a lot about the kinds of interventions and actions that you can take that will give you the most information. So there's been a bunch of work in the developmental literature looking at the idea of information gain as a reward signal for something like curiosity. But information gain is such a vague general term that it's not obvious that just having a measure of information gain is going to work. And the famous examples are things like the curiosity-based agents that I mentioned that Polkett and Deepak had worked at, get stuck in front of the random fuzz on the television, right? And you don't want them to do that. But the nice thing about causal representations is that we have much more systematic relationships between the kinds of interventions that you need to perform, the kinds of exploration you should do in order to be able to discover causal structure. And in work that we've done, the work that I mentioned, the beautiful work that Rosemary, Annalisa, and Jess are working on, I think we're showing that children are actually doing those kinds of interventions and explorations.
Oh, great, thank you. Okay, our next most upvoted question, let's see, from Zeke. What do you see as being the best theoretical framework for exploring or exploiting, i.e. for exploring the explore-exploit framework?
Right.
Is it reinforcement learning, optimal experimental design, sampling and/or energy models, something else?
Yeah, that's another great question. So it's been interesting and challenging for us. The explore-exploit language really came out to a large extent of reinforcement learning. So the kind of classic examples are bandit tasks, where you have a choice between two levers and you can choose the one that gives you the higher reward, but sometimes you should choose the one that gives you the lower reward. And a lot of the empirical work about this and a lot of the theoretical thinking has been in the context of those bandit tasks. But of course, those are ridiculously simple tasks. They don't actually have they're not tasks. I mean, even in those tasks, there's advantages to exploration. But where you really would see advantages to exploration is in searching through high-dimensional hypothesis spaces. And the ways that I came to that was thinking about this search problem in the context of Bayesian inference, for example. So if you think about Bayesian hypothesis discovery, especially Bayesian causal hypothesis discovery, you have this problem that you very rapidly get a very, very big space of possibilities. And just to sort of summarize what I think some of the history in cognitive science is, there was a lot of excitement back in the aughts about having Bayesian approaches, and still is a lot of, there still is a lot of excitement about these Bayesian approaches. But the big problem was always, how do you search through the space? I can show you that I can give kids one hypothesis, ask them to choose between two hypotheses, and they'll choose the one with the best posterior probability, but that's just giving them two. The space is much wider. So my actual approach to this came through thinking about sampling as a solution to that, which is sort of a typical solution. And sampling, again, raises these same kinds of issues. So I think one thing that's happening is that you're getting this in the kind of reinforcement learning context, but you're also getting it in the context of hypothesis sampling in something like a Bayesian context. And again, in the causal context, you have the advantage that because you can specify what the hypothesis space is more clearly, you can have other ways of kind of exploring that space. But I think my sort of general picture is, and this goes back to optimality theory, where people were talking about this in the first place, is there's this very, very general problem, which is the search problem for creatures who are good at high dimensional search, and the kinds of approaches to exploration are going to apply in different ways to different kinds of search problems.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we should try to get in another, at least one, maybe two questions. Very well voted one here we've got from Sean. What are some concrete ways, in your opinion, that child development can inspire novel AI?
Well, so the sort of things that we've been working on, and I think this is still very early days, right? So, we are, kind of just starting some of this. You can already see the way that, say, curiosity-based learning has inspired AI. But the truth is, we don't know very much about exactly how it is that children are managing to explore. So my hope is that we can do this kind of parallel enterprise of putting the children in these AI environments and then seeing what do they actually do. And a lot of what comes out is sort of unexpected, as it always is when you're doing developmental work. So for instance, in this work that we were just doing with the causal exploration, it turns out that children are actually exploring a wider range of causal hypotheses than we would typically think of if we were designing an AI system, for example. So they're kind of finding things, narrowing in on potential hypotheses that don't look like the ones that you would build in if you were just starting the system. So the question is, why are they doing that, and how could you think about doing that? And I think the same thing's true about looking at the kinds of interventions that children are producing, and then trying to see how are those interventions related. And again, this very challenging thing about how do you get balance, noise, and exploration is something that I think we could get some empirical leverage on by looking at how children are actually working. And I think, again, this will be boilerplate for this group, but I think the idea of integrating some of the deep learning kinds of techniques and the more structured exploration techniques is a good way of trying to solve a good approach to solving those problems. So, people like Pierre Oudoué and others have been working on these sets of problems for a long time, but I do think there's some real benefits to be gained by working in tandem on both trying to understand the children and trying to understand the systems at the same time.
Cool, thank you. So here's a related question from Alana. So obviously we can get a lot to inform AI from studying children and infants and their behavior. Do you think we can gain much by using brain imaging, like for AI? Obviously you can learn about the brain that way, but does brain imaging add an additional piece of the puzzle for AI systems?
I think that's a really good question. I've been a bit of a skeptic about brain imaging in general. I think here's my perhaps somewhat egocentric view is that, you know how with bands and books, like there's the ones that everybody thinks are underrated and then ones that everybody thinks are overrated, even though that seems kind of weird, right? That everybody thinks that, I don't know, Mose Allison is underrated, someone else is overrated. So I think in psychology, everybody thinks that developmental psychology is underrated and imaging is overrated. And it's still true that developmental psychology is underrated and imaging is overrated. Imaging can certainly tell you a lot about a really important question, which is where and how in the brain are these things being done. But I do think, again, to be fair, I mean, imaging has moved a lot from sort of being the phrenology kind of picture about this part's lighting up and that part's lighting up to having more computational neuroscience accounts. And after all, to be fair, the very idea of neural networks came from thinking about brain function, even before we had imaging. So, and I must say, again, the psychedelics have really changed my mind about how informative that is, because I think that's one example where having the imaging data really told us a lot in a really interesting way about both phenomenology and function, which we would not have had if we hadn't had that kind of data.
Cool, great. Alana, really liked your answer, by the way. Now, maybe I'll just sneak in one last question, and then we should move on to the panel discussion. Do you have any idea what are the critical periods, i.e. periods of high plasticity for different parts of the brain, or is it constant throughout the brain? Might it be related to the age times where children happen to demonstrate certain types of exploratory features?
Yeah, exactly. So I won't try and go back to my slide, but if you look at the slide, again, that absolutely classic slide from Huttenlocher that's showing synaptic development. What you see is that, and I often talk about this when I'm showing that slide, what you see is you see this pattern across the whole brain where you start out with more plasticity and then you end up with more efficiency. But it's interesting that if you look at specific brain areas, it tracks learning. So for instance, if you look at the visual system, what you seem to see is that early period of plasticity runs till about 2, and then it becomes more efficient. And we know from decades of work on things like amblyopia that you have this period of visual plasticity early on, and if things don't get established, then it's much harder to establish them later. If you look at the temporal lobes, if you look at the language areas, sure enough, it's about age 5 that you start seeing the shift from plasticity to efficiency. So, and we know that by the time kids are about 5, they've learned their first language, and it becomes harder to learn another language later on. And then, of course, if you're looking at frontal development, that seems to be the latest development, and we know that that's going on even in adolescence. And a very interesting idea that we actually have some data for is that adolescence, for example, might be like another round of annealing in the social areas of the brain. So there's some nice evidence that even though, and we have empirical evidence that even though plasticity and flexibility shuts down around adolescence for things like intuitive physics, for things like social learning, you actually seem to see this big rebirth of plasticity in later on in development. So I think exactly what you'll see is that different kinds of, by the way, Goldalend's lovely work with MDMA with mice, which is incredibly elegant work, shows that it's social plasticity in particular, this plastic period for social learning, that seems to be the thing that's kept open by MDMA, which makes sense in lots of different ways. So no, I think exactly what you'll see is that you'll see different periods. And I should add that one of the things that I think is very interesting about the relationship to broader numinous consciousness, aside from the fact that it's cool, is that, adults in human adults, as long as human adults have been around, they've done this thing where they set up situations in which they put their brains into this state. It might be ayahuasca, it might be meditation, it might be going on a retreat, it might be engaging in various kinds of spiritual practices. And at least the argument, at least the thing that people claim, is that putting your brain in that kind of state enables you to have some of the advantages, even as an adult, now for things like, addiction or anxiety or depression, those very adult kinds of narrowings of function that enable you to get back to a period of plasticity. So, I don't think adults really are desperate to have more visual plasticity or maybe even more linguistic plasticity, but it might be important, again, to have plasticity in some of these areas. And I think human beings have figured out the fact that they can induce this kind of plasticity. And of course, another thing that's interesting is that it's almost, when you go on a retreat, you're not being very productive. That's the whole point, right? You kind of purposely are not doing any of the exploit activities. So anyway, I think there's periods of plasticity throughout development, including adulthood. And the idea would be that you could kind of index these both in terms of their function and their neuroscience and their phenomenology.
Wonderful. Okay, there are still many questions, and I know people want to continue asking you about this fascinating topic. But I think in the interest of time, we should move on to the panel discussion now. So everyone, please join me in thanking Alison again for her wonderful talk. And we will all reconnect momentarily for our final session of the final event of this morning's session, the panel discussion with Alison, but also Yoshua Bengio, Dan Dennett, Anil Seth, Lucia Maloney, and Karim Jerby. See you all in a moment.